So the next section is securing folders and content. Whatever users and groups in there, the next thing is to do is to give them somewhere to put their content and then set up security for that content. So in this section, we'll look at defining a security model. We don't go through that in a lot of detail, but there is a good bit of detail about it in supplemental slides in this section. We're going to look at how to create folders within Viya. We'll learn about the general authorization system, a little bit more about rules, which we've touched on already, but we'll get some more detail. About sharing, which Terry mentioned this morning to you. We'll look at it more from an administration perspective. We'll do a little bit of comparison with 9.4 in terms of the SAS 9 authorization system compared to the general authorization system. And then in the hands-on, you're going to create some folders and set some security up on the folders. Once you've done that, we'll also look at how to look at a particular resource and see a user's effective access to it and what are the reasons that they get that access or don't get that access. And then we'll look at testing a security model, which is important. Once you've set it up, you want to be able to test it to make sure it's doing its job. So defining a security model is really a process you would do with a customer when you're first in there talking to a customer. Really, like any other project, you're going to want to gather security requirements up front to see what are the security requirements. We've kind of given you the security requirements in our environment. We're saying we want the HR users to be able to see HR content, but not sales content, and vice versa. And then after you've gathered the requirements, you would design the security model, document it. If you design it and just implement it, that's great, but what happens if you want to change it or if someone else comes in and needs to be able to understand what you've done? So documentation is important. And then if you've done those 3 steps, implementation actually should be fairly simple. The sort of heavy lifting is in the getting the requirements and designing the model. And then finally you will want to test it. So as I mentioned, there's a good bit of detail in the supplemental materials on the subject of defining security models. So folders. It was also mentioned this morning by Terry that SAS Drive is this new interface that we have to content within Viya. And one of the features of that new interface is the ability to create folders. So there is a new folder icon within Viya. There's also in the content area of SAS Drive, you can also right click on a location in the SAS content tree and you can say new folder and it will create a new folder for you. If you select a folder or select any object within a folder in SAS Drive, you can see the details about the object. And also within SAS Drive, you can copy objects. You can copy an object from one location to another. That might not seem like a big deal, but you couldn't copy from the interface in any release up to this point. So you couldn't copy an object in Viya 3.3. In Viya 3.4, SAS Drive gives us the ability to copy in objects from one folder to another. Kind of useful. And then we also have this capability to share, which we mentioned earlier. You can share all objects from the share pop-up, and you can view and edit the permissions for objects and for folders from that share pop-up also. So you can access authorization from within SAS Drive. Before we had SAS Drive, and we still have the same thing, we have in SAS Environment Manager the content area. You have been in Environment Manager already. You've seen, you make the selections on the left-hand side for what you want to access. The little folder icon gives you access to the content area within Environment Manager. And that's another place you can see the folder tree. So now we have the folder tree surfaced in Drive and some functionality in there, and the folder tree surfaced in Environment Manager content area. Within the content area, you can do some of the same things, like creating a new folder, navigating the folder structure, selecting a folder to see its properties, or an object to see its properties. But you will notice I didn't say anything about copying objects in there. Within the content area, you can move things around, so you can move something from a folder to another, but you can't copy. SAS Drive is the place that you can copy. We also have the ability to create folders via the CLI. So you've used the identity CLI a little bit. There's a folder CLI, which you can use to do all those things that you did within the content area of creating new folders and creating subfolders. You can do that via the CLI. So whether you do it within Environment Manager or whether you do it within the CLI, it's really up to you. If you're only creating a few folders in Environment Manager, it's really easy to do it. It's a point and click. But if you're creating a complex folder structure or something that you want to repeat, so you might want to create it in one environment and another environment, then if you create it in the CLI, it's really easy to implement it somewhere else. You run your script, it creates your folders for you. In the course materials, we're going to use the scripts because we don't really need to teach you how to right-click and say new folder. I think you can all probably do that already. So we'll teach you how to use the scripts. So that's how we're going to get our content into the environment and give the users a location to save it. What we want to do though is set authorization on that content area, on those folders. And the authorization system that we're going to look at is the general authorization system. So this slide shows you a number of authorization systems that apply to Viya. The general authorization is applied to folders and content. The CAS authorization system, which we'll look at tomorrow, applies to data. So CAS, lives and tables. And the other authorization systems we have in other environments as well. The file system, we also always put stuff in the file system, right? So we have we're talking about a Linux environment, so we have Linux permissions on the file system for any assets we have there. And we've already mentioned we might have third-party authorization systems relating to databases like Postgres or DB2. So you always have to be aware of them. You might also have to be aware about SAS 9 authorization if you have SAS 9 interacting with a Viya environment. But in this section, we're going to focus on the general authorization system. So the general authorization system, it applies to folders and objects within Viya. So folders and content. We've already seen rules. It uses rules to determine effective access using attributes. So the attributes of an object determine whether a user can access it or not. It has inheritance like we had in SAS 9.4. So a folder's content inherits the permissions from the folder. So we have that same type of inheritance we had in SAS 9.4. And in terms of precedence, precedence is which permission wins if there's a permission conflict. It's a bit different from SAS 9.4. First of all, there's an implicit prohibit in Viya. So by default, if you're not granted access to a folder or an object, then you don't have access to it. So by default, implicit prohibit. So that's the first thing. And then you also have the explicit prohibit. If you prohibit access to an object, then wherever there's a prohibit, anywhere in the inheritance path, the group inheritance path or the folder inheritance path, an explicit prohibit always wins. So a prohibit is a really, really powerful thing in Viya because it's always going to trump any grant, either the implicit grant or an explicit grant. So that's something you need to be aware of when you're creating your security models and implementing your security. Prohibit is very powerful. Where do we set authorization? There's a couple of places. One place is in the content area. We can right-click on anything within the content area and select either view or edit authorization. If you select edit authorization, you get an edit view of the object and you can change it. If you select view, it's just opened in view mode, but there's the ability within a view to go into edit mode. You can also click on this little icon here and that will get you to authorization to the lock with the person on it. So what that opens up is the authorization window. The authorization window has the principals for the object, so that's the users or groups, and then has the permissions, and each cell has a permission setting for that principal. You will see something different than you saw in SAS 9.4 here. There's two sets of permissions. You can see the first set of permissions is read, update, delete, secure, add, remove. they're the permissions for that folder. So I clicked on the analysis folder, and that's the permissions for that folder, the actual object itself. And then beside that, you'll see kind of the same set of permissions with the word convey after them. They are the permissions that will be passed on to the folder's children. So conveyed to the folder's children. So that's the permissions that are inherited down the hierarchy. So permissions for the object here, and then conveyed permissions are permissions that are inherited, passed on. So you can have a different permission for an object than you're going to give to that object's children. I mentioned rules. The rules are made up of a setting, which is either going to be a grant or a prohibit, a permission. So in this example, I've got read. For a principal, that's going to either be a group or a user on a target. In this case, it's a folder. Could be a report, right, or something else. And in addition, with the general authorization system, you can set conditional filters. So you can have a grant based on a time period. So only grant people access to this resource on a weekday, but not on the weekend. You can have it based on a time zone. So you can get, the rules can get pretty powerful because you can have these conditional grants or prohibits on objects. So this is the authorization window, and I can make changes in it to change authorization for that object. And this is the rules page. When you make a change in the authorization window, it actually generates rules, and the rules show up in the rules page. But you can also go in and create rules as a different way to apply permissions. So you can do the permissions in the authorization window on the object, and that's kind of the intuitive way to do it. Or you can do them in here in the rules window. It's a little bit less intuitive, but it's a lot less clicks actually when you do it. So you can create a new rule for an object or a container or both and grant the permissions within it. So the rules area has a filter criteria where you can search the rules, a list of all the general authorization rules, and as the slide says, that's really kind of an encoding of the permissions. That's how the permissions are applied to the system. And you can create rules, or if you use the authorization window, it will generate rules for you. Yeah. Even those generated rules, you could go in and edit them in the rules area. So in this case, we've looked at editing a particular rule. This rule applies to an object, which is a folder, and it also applies to that object as a container as well. So it really has two sets of permissions. It has permissions for the object itself and permissions that the container URI, permissions that the object will pass to its content. It's set for the principal type is group, and it's set for HR. It gives a grant, and there's no condition, and it's grant and read permission. So that rule is basically saying grant read permission to this folder for the HR group, and grant read permission to any content within that folder, because I've got the container URI in there also. So two ways to define permissions. You'll probably find which way you prefer as you get to use the application. So let's look at a little comparison between 9.4 metadata and Viya general authorization. Who's familiar with defining metadata security in SAS 9.4? Anyone? So a few of you. So you guys will be familiar with this picture over here, right? About how conflicts are negotiated in terms of precedence in the 9.4 authorization system, right? Pretty simple, right? Yeah. Not simple at all, right? Pretty complicated. Good news is we're going to ignore it. We just know that it's complicated, but we don't need to know anything about it to do this in Viya, because in Viya, precedence is really simple. There's an implicit prohibit. You can grant to override that implicit prohibit, of course, right? If you couldn't grant over an implicit prohibit, then you wouldn't be able to give anyone permissions. So you get a prohibit by default. You can grant to override it. So that's the next level up. But if you do a prohibit anywhere, that overrides a grant. Prohibits are all powerful. That's the only precedence rule there is in SAS Viya. So very different from SAS 9.4, but a lot simpler. But a change in mindset if you're thinking about how you're going to set up your security model. So the other thing that's a little different is in Viya, in terms of the inheritance within the identity hierarchy, there is, in SAS 9.4, inheritance was hierarchical, right? So if Hamish was a member of HR and a member of GELCORE, because HR was a member of GELCORE, then his membership of HR had a higher precedence than his membership of GELCORE, because where it was in the hierarchy. In Viya, you still have precedence. You still have inheritance of group membership, but it's evaluated in a flat way. So Hamish is definitely a member of HR and GELCORE, but none of those, GELCORE nor HR holds a higher weight than the other. It's inherited, and its precedence is flat. So Hamish is a member of HR is a member of GELCORE, but as far as Viya is concerned, all Viya really cares about is that Hamish is a member of both of those groups. Doesn't matter how it gets its membership. And the permissions are slightly different than SAS 9.4, but they're fairly self-evident. Create permission allows you to create a new object. The read permission allows you to read an object. Update allows you to update or edit an object. Delete an object. Secure allows you to set permissions on an object. So if you have secure, you can set authorization or change the rules of an object. Add allows you to put an object into a container. So if you have add permission on a folder, then you can add stuff to the folder. And remove allows you to move an object out of a container. So if you have remove, then you can move an object out of that folder. And I think that's it. So to try and make this a bit more real for you, we have an animated slide that will go through a couple of scenarios. And we use the symbols that you're going to see within the application. So the symbol with the red line through it means not authorized due to a prohibit inherited from a parent object, or because any permission not granted is implicitly prohibited. So an inherited prohibit or the implicit prohibit that everything gets. If it's got a little diamond beside it, that means it's not authorized due to a direct explicit prohibit applied for that principle on the object. So someone's applied a direct prohibit to the object for that permission. Authorized is a green check mark, either due to a grant inherited from a parent or due to it being inherited from group membership. And then an explicit grant has got the little diamond beside it. So if we look at this, in the example, we're thinking of the update permission for a particular user. And we're going to look at the parent folder, the folder, and the object. So any permission not granted is implicitly prohibited. So I already said that. There's an implicit prohibit. When you create an object, you have to grant people access to it, or only you have access to the object and the SAS administrator. If you do an explicit grant, it overrides an implicit prohibit. So if I grant access to an object, grant someone access to update an object, it overrides the implicit deny, implicit prohibit. And that applies as you go up the hierarchy. So your grants override the implicit prohibit. If you couldn't override the implicit prohibit, you would never be able to give anyone access to anything. So that makes sense. If you do an implicit prohibit on top of an explicit prohibit on top of the implicit prohibit, doesn't make any difference, right? You can't double prohibit. It's already prohibited. If you do an explicit prohibit lower down than an explicit deny, then that an explicit prohibit lower down than an explicit grant, then that overrides the explicit grant for the rest of the hierarchy. If you do a explicit prohibit, and then below that in the hierarchy you do an explicit grant, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to be a grant. It's going to be a deny, right? So it does take a shift in mindset. It is different. But wherever you have a prohibit, it's going to trump a grant, no matter where the prohibit occurs. So that's very different than SAS 9.4. So it's going to be a deny for everything below it. So a prohibit anywhere in the inheritance hierarchy will result in the effective access being prohibit. It always wins. Any questions on that? Okay. So as I've mentioned to a couple of people already, it's a best practice to avoid using prohibits if possible. You see how powerful they are, right? You can get yourself into a lot of bother if you design a security model in Viya that relies on prohibits. You're going to be searching around for a needle in a haystack trying to find why someone can't access something. Okay, as I said earlier, Terry mentioned sharing. It's a new thing to Viya 3.4, the ability to share objects with other users. So general authorization now has sharing rules, and we're going to look at them in a bit of detail in the slides that come up. We also have this thing called projects, which is another way to share things within Viya. We don't really talk about projects here in the class. Projects, do you talk about projects, MK? Yeah, so MK will talk a bit more about projects. But projects are different from sharing, and projects really are just a way to group objects and give a set of people access to them in a container. But that doesn't mean that the permissions on the object still apply. So you could give people access to objects within a project and them not be able to access a particular object because they're not allowed to access it due to the security rules. So it's just really a way to group objects within a container and have a set of people work on the objects together, but still governed by the security that applies to that particular object. So let's talk about sharing. It's available within SAS Drive. That's the location where you can share things, not in the content area in SAS Environment Manager. So only in SAS Drive for this release. To be able to share, you need to share an object or a folder, you need to have the secure permission on the object. So I described secure permission allows you to set authorization. Secure permission also governs whether you can share something. Or the object has to have been shared with you personally. So either you have secure permission on the object or someone shared the object with you. If it's been shared with you, you can share it. If you share a folder, it also shares its content. So if you're sharing a folder, content is shared. A share can't do any restriction of a user's access. A share only grants access. And a share doesn't guarantee access. What we said about prohibits in the general authorization still applies to shares. If there's a prohibit somewhere from another rule, it's going to prevent the person you shared the item with from seeing it. And sharing doesn't go up the inheritance path. So if you share a report, a user would still have to have access to the folder to be able to access the report. It doesn't grant access to the folder higher up the hierarchy. When you do a share, like I said about setting authorization in the authorization window, similar to that, when you do a share, it creates a set of sharing rules within the interface. And you can go into the interface and look at those rules. The way you find them is you filter on the description. And the description has shared or shared an object with. For every sharing rule, it has that text in it. So if you filter on that text and do apply, then you'll get the rules, the sharing rules will show up on the right-hand side. An administrator can see those sharing rules and look at them, can copy, but can't copy them or edit them in the rules page. So you can't create a sharing rule in the rules page, you can't edit a sharing rule in the rules page. But an administrator can delete a sharing rule in the rules page. So you could view them or delete them, but you can't create a sharing rule from within the rules page. The only way to create a sharing rule is for a user to do a share. All this is can be turned off within SAS Environment Manager. So you can turn off, in the configuration of the authorization service, you can turn off sharing, so users wouldn't be able to do any sharing. Or you can leave sharing on and you can turn off resharing. So that's kind of two levels of control. You can completely turn sharing off, or you can leave sharing on but not allow people to reshare something. So if you shared with me, then that would be it. I couldn't reshare on with anyone else. You got a question?
No, repeat that where, if I want just one person to have it and I don't want them to share it.
You would have to turn off resharing here. Yeah.
Is that when I create the share?
No, that's our system-wide configuration.
So if I were creating it and I didn't want to go into system-wide configuration, would I need to like put that one person in a custom group and then share with the group so that then...
Yeah, that would be one way to do it, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that might be convoluted.
But then they still could, someone else could still share with them and let them pass it on, yeah. Yeah. So this stuff is new in 3.4, so yeah, you'll probably think of a lot of things like that in the next 10, 15 minutes, yeah. So the sharing feature really delegates some of the control for access to content and folders from the administrator to the users, right? You might think that's dangerous, or it could be a recipe for disaster in your organization when people start to share this stuff. It's not really as bad as it seems because of that one thing that I mentioned earlier. You have to have the secure permission to be able to share. So typically, not everyone has the secure permission, so not everyone's going to be able to share. Secure permission might be something that you would allow a set of content administrators have, but not every single user. You're not going to give every single user the ability to edit authorization on an object, which is what the secure permission allows. So from an admin perspective, I don't think it's that big a deal because of that one issue, that one ability. You need to have that secure permission to be able to share things on. If I was on the other side and I'm a user, I don't think it makes the sharing that, that powerful because you have to have that permission. So it's probably a balance. They've tried to strike a balance in it, and they've erred on the side of we are supposed to be secure by default, and so they've went along with that goal for Viya as a whole to be secure by default.
So just to try and get a better grasp on it, so I'm in sales and there's a sales folder.
Yep.
I can't see the HR folder. I don't have permission for
Right.
it. I create a new report in the sales folder.
Yeah.
Because I created it, do I by default have secure permission on that report?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I were to
the
share
person
it,
who created it, yeah.
if I were to share it with an HR user who doesn't have access to the overall sales folder, would they be able to see that report?
No, they wouldn't, yeah.
Okay.
Because it's still governed by the other rules that are available, yeah. So it's still governed by the general authorization system. So if they're prohibited from accessing it, then the prohibit still trumps any permissions generated by the share.
Well, but what if it wasn't an explicit prohibit? It was just an implicit prohibit on this. They were not granted permission to the sales folder, but they were granted to the
I see what you're
sales
saying.
report. What trumps there?
Yeah, I would think it would override an implicit prohibit, but we might want to, we'll probably check that for sure. This is new to us too, so we'll check into that, yeah. So sharing with an individual user delegates the ability to reshare. So if you don't want to have the reshares, then you can disable reshare like we saw. And then the SAS administrator still has full control because the SAS administrator can go in and delete any share rules if something violates something that they don't like. So they can go in and they can delete share rules, and by deleting a share rule, the share goes away. Okay? But we'll follow up on that one, maybe tomorrow morning. So that's the end of sharing. Any questions on sharing before I move on to the last few slides?
So I just have one question. So if you're delegating the ability to reshare, even though that user does not have the secure ability, they can still reshare without secure?
Right, yeah. If it's been shared with them, yeah, yeah. If they've been shared, they can pass on the share if it's an individual user.
Okay.
If they're part of a group, no. If it's shared directly with them, then they can reshare as long as resharing is turned on.
Okay.
Yep. So given all we've talked about, it would be nice to be able to see effective access. So for a particular user, what access do they have to an object and why they got that access. And the good news is that the software does allow you to see effective access. So in this case, we're looking at the authorization for the sales folder. I want to see if Alex, what permissions Alex has, what effective access they have to that particular folder and how they got that access. So Alex is not listed in the principals. So even if I'm in view mode, I could still click on the add identities and add Alex. If I add Alex, then Alex is displayed in the principal area. So you could add any user there or multiple users to add them and see what permissions they have. If I click in the cell for Alex, so I'm interested in the update permission for Alex. If I click in the cell, it brings up this window. And this window tells me that Alex's effective access for the update permission on that folder is authorized. So Alex can update that folder. If I click on, so authorized, if I click on contributing rules, that's going to give me an explanation of why Alex can update that folder. We click on it, we see a rule which grants gel core content admins update on the container gel content gel core and no other contributing rules. So meaning by his membership of the gel core content admins group, Alex has effective update permission on that folder. So for each one of these cells, so that's basically it, but for each one of these cells that you see here, you could do that thing. So if I want to see for sales why they're denied update, I click on that cell, I'm going to get that window, it's going to say their effective permission, contributing rules are going to tell me what rules made that decision, contributed to that decision.
Is there somewhere, this is, if someone were trying to figure out when one of, like, they don't know why somebody doesn't have permission, right? And they can go see that this rule was set up. Is there somewhere to see when this rule was set up? Like a timestamp somewhere?
Yeah, on the rules page, they're all timestamped. So
Okay.
in that rules page that I showed you that has a list of the rules and then has the filter on the left-hand side, you could filter by date and time.
Okay.
You can filter by who modified it. You can filter by
Okay, so
the
in theory,
URI.
they can go back and see, okay, on this date, this person
right.
set this, and then they can go.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So finally, when you have all your security set up, it's a good idea to test it, right? So we have some scripts available that allow you to test effective access for your security model. And it's something you should probably do periodically as things change. You should run scripts or have some other mechanism to test if your security model is holding up. We have a set of tools, the Viya tools that we've actually already used in class. They are a Python tool that calls the REST API to do some functionality. And so I created those tools, and my colleague David Stern added a tool that tests folder access. It does some REST calls to the authorization service to check whether people have access to folders, and you'll use it in the hands-on to test your security model and make sure that it's been set up accurately.
Does it provide you a report of which users have access?
Yep.
It's
It's going to output on the screen if users have access. You can run it in quiet mode, and it will only tell you if there's someone, if the security model's failed, or you can run it in verbose mode, and it's going to give you the details of the access for particular users to a folder or a report or whatever you pass in.
I was also wondering, on the Viya, do we have a interface where you could go to a user and see what permission that individual user has? All the permission, inherited or direct, implicit? No?
No, nothing at that level yet. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Esma asked if there's something in Viya where you could access an individual user and see all the permissions they have and what they have access to. We don't have anything like that yet, no. It could be built because everything's REST and all the interfaces are exposed. So it's probably something that could be built. So we're going to do a hands-on. I can't see the clock. What time is it? 5. So yeah, we can start it. We're going to do a hands-on, which is building the security model. We have a document in the hands-on folder that shows you the security model design. So if you're interested in how it was built, go in and look at that, how it was designed. We know it's designed to make sure that HR can't access sales content and sales can't access HR content. The document will show you the folder structure and how the security model was designed. In the hands-on, you'll go and do implementation of a couple of authorizations in the interface and then some more with the CLI.